Hi, this is Anthony Mosley, and I want to welcome you to the very first episode of Explorations with Anthony Mosley, dealing with history. And in particular, I want to walk through the 11-volume Stories of Civilization done by Will and Ariel Durant. It's a wonderful series, has really fascinated me as it cuts across not just history, but philosophy and a wide range of the arts as well. So I want to start in particular with volume 7, which is entitled The Age of Reason Begins. And ironically, I don't have a great reason for starting with volume 7. I've done reading in volume 9 and 10, but I didn't want to go all the way back to the ancient Greeks to begin this series. I figured that The Age of Reason, beginning in the 1500s, is probably more relevant to the modern world, at least. So, The Age of Reason Begins is where I'm going to start with this. Now, just to give you an overview, each of these volumes is divided up into books. Those books are divided up into chapters. Those chapters are divided up into sections. So, what I want to do is focus on a very specific section for each of the episodes that I do. And the sections are small. They're usually 3, 4, 5 pages. So it's a manageable chunk of content. This is probably going to be as boring as can be for the average person who stumbles across this on YouTube. But for those very unique historical nerds who come across this, who happen to be reading Will Durant's The Story of Civilization, and you happen to be in the Age of Reason Begins, this could be a real fun journey for you to follow through with me as I explore it as well. So I'm going to put a graphic on the bottom of the screen, and the graphic will always be there throughout the series. You'll be able to see the book, the chapter, and the section. So in this case, it is the English Ecstasy is the book, the Great Queen is the chapter, and the first section is the Uses of Adversity. So let's go ahead and get started with this series, which is Who is Elizabeth I? And on the screen, I'll put a portrait of her in her royalness later in her reign. Let's move to another portrait, which is a portrait of her as a 13-year-old Elizabeth. And I don't know what you were doing when you were 13 years old, but I was not looking this formal. Nor was I looking this scholarly. You see she's got her finger indexed in the book as if she's really in the middle of learning and discovery, and was rudely interrupted by this portrait. But she was a wonderful scholar, picked up multiple languages, was apparently just very, very bright as a student and as a thinker. Now, trivia for you. Well, actually, it's more than trivia. Who were her parents? Who were the parents of Elizabeth I, Queen of England? And by the way, she reigned from 1558 is when she took the throne until 1603. So 45 years. It's a long reign. Her dad was Henry VIII, and her mom was Anne Boleyn, who was the second of Henry VIII's 6 wives. So her early life, and I'm not going to go through it in great detail, but like I mentioned, she had a wonderful education. And she was next in line to the throne after Henry VIII, except that she had a couple major road bumps. Number one, her mother was killed by Henry VIII, was beheaded, and so that made her illegitimate to continue in succession to the throne. Secondly, Henry VIII remarried, now to his third wife, Jane Seymour, and they had a child who eventually became Edward VI. So even though Edward VI was younger than Elizabeth, he was next in line to the throne. What all that meant, combined with the illegitimacy, combined with Edward VI now being on the scene and being in line for the throne, is that Elizabeth was put on the shelf. And she was put on the shelf in this wonderful estate called Hatfield, the Hatfield House. Actually, it was probably the Hatfield Palace back then. I'll put a picture up on the screen here so you can see the remains of the old castle. And this was the building that Elizabeth would have been in. There's only about a sixth of the building that remains compared to what it was back in her time. Apparently the place was kind of run down. But the bricks were repurposed for other structures. So let's fast forward 25 years into the future after her birth. So she's living at the Hatfield property at 25 years old, doing whatever she's doing. It was kind of an imprisonment in a sense. She had spent a stint at the Tower of London because it appeared that she was involved in a plot to overthrow Mary, who was the queen after Henry VIII, who was the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabel of Spain. So anyway, there was that Spanish connection. So she's kind of just passing time as a 25-year-old living at the Hatfield property. By the way, I went to the modern website of the Hatfield house. And here's a little bit of trivia for you. That property has been used to film a number of major movies. So I'm going to give you a list of some movies. And one of these movies was not filmed at the Hatfield house property. See if you can guess which one. And this is 36 miles north of London. It's close to the Pinewood Studios, where the whole James Bond franchise is filmed. So it does have a close tie to the movie industry in the UK. Okay, here's the list of movies. One of these was not filmed at the Hatfield house property. Wonder Woman, the most recent movie of that. Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. Tomorrow Never Dies in the James Bond series. The King's Speech. Batman Begins. Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, the new one with Johnny Depp. Got a guess yet? Tomb Raider. Shakespeare in Love. Sleepy Hollow. And Band of Brothers. So I won't go through that whole list again, but can you guess which of those was not filmed there on the property of Elizabeth I's childhood home? The answer is the James Bond film, surprisingly, Tomorrow Never Dies, even though it's just very close to the Pinewood Studios where that whole franchise takes place. But all the other ones were filmed at least in part there on that property. And that's only probably a fifth of the films that were done there in recent years. Anyway, moving on in our timeline of history to the moment of her taking power. Again, she's on the shelf. She's sitting under a tree at the Hatfield house when a courier thunders up to her on a horse and announces that she is now the Queen of England. And so her life changes on November 17th of 1558. And a couple days later, just 2 days later on the 19th, she writes this wonderful speech. And in fact, I'm going to bring up the graphic on that so you can see what that looks like in her own handwriting. Let me expand this a bit on my computer so I can read the first couple lines of this as well. Okay, you see the seal over on the left-hand side, and the second major paragraph on the bottom of the page starts off with the word my. Okay, so follow along. See if you can follow her handwriting as I read the first couple lines of this. My lords, the law of nature moveth me to sorrow for my sister. The burden that is fallen upon me maketh me amazed, and yet considering I am God's creature, ordained to obey his appointment, I will thereto yield, desiring from the bottom of my heart that I might have assistance of his grace to be the minister of his heavenly will in this office now committed to me, comma. This whole thing may be one giant run-on sentence. So I'm going to end the reading there. But interesting to see her own handwriting in a speech that really marked the beginning of her rule as the Queen of England. So in January, she was formally crowned as monarch of England and probably Ireland and Scotland. I don't know. Mary Queen of Scots was at Scotland at the time. It's hard to keep track of the domain of which they were over at any given point for me. Let's take a look at this picture that shows her, Elizabeth I, with the scepter and the orb with cross. Okay, these are part of the British crown jewels. And when I saw this photo, this portrait, I began wondering, well, let's see if I can find a high resolution modern photo of the stuff that she's holding. Well, no such thing exists because the crown jewels that Elizabeth is holding here in this portrait were melted down around 1649 during the English Civil War, in which they decided, yeah, we're just going to do away with the English monarchy. So all that stuff was done away with. Most of the jewels that we associate today with the British crown jewels are from about 350 years ago, dating back to the coronation of Charles II, so 1661 in that ballpark. The jewels also, as you probably know, if you've ever been to London and have done the tourist thing, are housed in the Tower of London, which is kind of an interesting choice. I was thinking about that. That would almost be like, in my mind, of us keeping, as Americans, the copy of the Constitution in Alcatraz or Fort Leavenworth. I mean, the Tower of London is a prison. But anyway, I'm sure it makes sense in their scheme of things somehow. Here's a look at the current scepter, just to show you what the modern, quote-unquote, jewels are. And this one features the world's largest diamond, as you probably know already. It's called the First Star of Africa. It was discovered in South Africa in 1905. And the diamond that you see here is named the Cullinan 1. They've got a second diamond they cut out of the same rock called the Cullinan 2, and that too is also part of the crown jewels. It was fashioned, and then in 1910 it was installed here in the scepter as the First Star of Africa. That diamond is 530 carats. By contrast, the largest diamond ever found in the United States was mined in Arkansas. It's 59 carats. Now get this, the original diamond, the rock that came out of the ground of which the First Star of Africa was cut from, that by itself was over 3,000 carats. So it was just this monstrous rock. And they got a lot of stuff out of that, including this one that you see here. Now we get to the orb and the cross, known as the Globus Cruciger. And this one is from the 1961 coronation of Charles II. Features 365 diamonds, weighs 43 ounces, all that fun stuff. Anyway, the cross on top represents the dominion of Christ over the world, and the agency through which the divine rule is executed takes place in the hand of the monarch. So, kind of a divine right of kings, in which Elizabeth did in fact buy into. So it's interesting that England now, from what I read, is the only country that still uses crown jewels that harken back to the medieval symbolism of religion. The other ones have kind of done away with that. So you see Elizabeth I holding the scepter, holding the Globus Cruciger, the orb and cross, and she buys into that. You know, she believes that she is in fact God's representative administering his wisdom and his providence here on the planet. Well, what about Elizabeth II, the most current monarch? She probably has a portrait. If I can find one, I'll stick it up here on the screen, of her holding the same stuff because it's just tradition. But in our modern contemporary age that has gone through the Enlightenment, that has entered into philosophical postmodernism and all that entails, to what extent does the symbolism of the cross over the earth held in the hand of the monarch hold sway? Especially when you look at how the monarchy in the United Kingdom has really transitioned into a figurehead. I almost think of them as an extension of the British Department of Tourism rather than the bastion of political power that it used to be. Anyway, Elizabeth I reigned 45 years. So it's 2019 when I'm making this. If we go back 45 years, we're talking about the Nixon administration here in the United States. So Watergate, all that stuff, that's a long time ago. But if you take Elizabeth II, some of you who haven't lived like a super long time, decades and decades, don't realize how long she's been around, but she would go back past the Nixon administration all the way to Harry S. Truman, 1952. She was crowned, the coronation was in 1953, but she became queen in 1952. So today, as I'm recording this, it is February 5th. Tomorrow is February 6th, probably when I'll release this, and it will mark 67 years that Queen Elizabeth II has been on the throne in England, and that is the longest that any monarch has ruled in English history. So anyway, to summarize, this section is called The Uses of Adversity, the first very section of this book. And that's because it highlights the challenges that Elizabeth faced on her way to the throne. The illegitimacy, taking a back seat to Edward VI, but eventually she was crowned. The whole book, the first about third of volume 7, dealing with the Age of Reason, is called The Ecstasy of England, because it looks at the rise of England as a superpower, and much of that was due to the reign of Elizabeth. So next time we'll explore the government of Elizabeth with special emphasis on the Star Chamber.